Donald Trump's dark past is surfacing while he is in China. Finally, the House of Representative Oversight Committee, which is a cover-up committee, has released the transcript of Howard Lutnick's interview. It was supposed to be a deposition under oath on video, but Donald Trump, MAGA Mike Johnson, and James Comer worked with Howard Lutnick, Donald Trump's Commerce Secretary, to demand and ensure, because Republicans control the House Oversight Committee, that this would not be a video deposition. No video, no deposition. It would be a voluntary interview. It would not be under oath. And the transcription was just released after a week or 2 weeks, and they were hoping for the news to fade, then release the transcript, a very dense transcript, and they were going to hope nobody was going to talk about it, but we're going to talk about it. I'm going to go through the transcript with you like we do here on the MeidasTouch network, and we should go through page by page what was being said by Howard Lutnick. I think one of the most important things, though, to know about this voluntary interview, in addition to it not being under oath, in addition to it not being on video, which violates like every other norm, every other interview, which were under oath depositions in House oversight work ever. And now because it involves Epstein and Donald Trump, they're not under oath and they're not video depositions. Howard Lutnick was not permitted to answer any questions about his communications with Donald Trump. There was an assertion of something called executive privilege. So anytime there was a question, what did Donald Trump tell you about his relationship with Epstein? Did you and Donald Trump cover up anything? Did Donald Trump tell you to change your story? Did you and Donald Trump talk about this about the island? Did you and Donald Trump talk about this person, that person, these girls? Objection, we're not going to answer. Executive privilege. We're not going to discuss any communications with Donald Trump. And given that Howard Lutnick has changed his story over and over again from that podcast that he gave with New York Post Miranda Devine, where Lutnick said that he would never see Epstein ever again after one 2005 encounter when he went to Epstein's townhouse. Epstein was his neighbor. There was Lutnick's townhouse. There was Epstein's townhouse. And Lutnick said there was just one occasion. Epstein knocked on my door. He invited me in. I went up. He showed me a massage table. I was there with my wife. I said, "What's that for?" He goes, "I'm into massages." And Lutnick said, "Oh, I'm so grossed out by you." I never was in a room with him ever again. Never for business, never for philanthropy, never for anything. I would never be with this guy ever again. He disgusts me. I knew what he was doing. I knew he was a bad guy. I knew he was the ultimate blackmailer. I knew what he was doing with the girls, so I would never be around him. Well, then the Epstein files came out, and Lutnick was in the files. There's photos of him with his children on the island. And so Lutnick was asked these types of questions, and Lutnick said, "I never lied. What are you talking about? When I was on the podcast, I said that I would never meet with Epstein again. I never met with Epstein again." And then the people questioning Lutnick said, "What do you mean you never met with him? You're on the island." "Yeah, I was on the island, but that wasn't me on the island." "What do you mean it wasn't you on the island?" "That was me and my wife and children and other families. And I brought kiddies with me. I brought the children with me. So I would never put myself in a position to be with Epstein, but I brought my children and my friends' children, and they were on. So we were there. So what I said on the podcast was accurate," to which the people questioning Lutnick are like, what are you even talking about? And then Lutnick claimed that he didn't know that Epstein was the owner of his home, right? So there was two townhouses right next to each other. They both used to be owned by Lex Wexner, the billionaire, shady guy who used to own Victoria's Secret, who was the kind of main benefactor for Jeffrey Epstein. And then Epstein, based on a lot of the records, was owning Lutnick's house and then owned the other unit, which Wexner, with Les Wexner previously owned. And then the questioning to Howard Lutnick was like, "Do you realize that you were living in Epstein's home?" "No, I don't recall." "You don't recall? What do you mean you don't recall? Do you know you're living in his house?" No, I don't know that. Okay, well, you said you weren't involved in any business relationship, philanthropy, or personal. Are you aware that your personal investments in a company called AdFin, which does like internet ads, and it was like a company that you invested in, that you and Epstein were both investors in this company, and your signature on the investment was next to Epstein's signature on the investment, and Epstein had them in his files, like you and Epstein invested together in this company called AdFin, and your signatures are right around each other, and Epstein had them. And then Lutnick's repeated line throughout this deposition was it's inexplicable. It's disturbing and inexplicable. I don't know. So how'd you get to the island? I don't know. It's disturbing and inexplicable. How did he send you an email? It's disturbing and inexplicable. And I didn't get the email. It just said to Howard Lutnick, but it actually goes to my assistant who uses the Howard Lutnick email. Well, did you speak with Ghislaine Maxwell? Have you met her? Yeah. What did you talk to her about? I don't know. Inconsequential. Meaningless and inconsequential. What did you talk to Epstein about on the island with the kids? I don't know. Meaningless and inconsequential. What did you talk about with Epstein when you were in his apartment, when you were hanging out? I don't know. Meaningless and inconsequential. And did you talk at all other times? Maybe once. What did you talk about? I don't know. Meaningless and inconsequential. So we have the transcript. Can I share with you just some, I think, key portions of this transcript right here, just so you can see for yourself? And this is coming out while Donald Trump is in China. By the way, did you see Xi Jinping sent out like all those little kids to be around Donald Trump with? In light of this, I thought Xi Jinping may have been trolling Donald Trump there, given the Epstein files. So here are some of the questioning of Lutnick. I'm just going to go through this page. This is page 92. Then I'm going to start at the beginning. Bear with me here because I want you to see what Lutnick's actually saying. Question. I'm going to ask a few questions. We're getting to the end here. I'm going to ask a few questions about Trump. Some versions of them you have been asked. Others you have not. Just firstly, how long have you known President Trump? Answer, more than 30 years. How did you originally meet? I don't remember. Did you ever have a conversation with Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell about Trump? Answer, no. At any time when Trump was a private citizen, were you present for a conversation about Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell, where Trump was then Donald Trump was also present? In other words, were you ever in his company where Epstein or Maxwell were discussed? Answer, no. At any time when President Trump was president, did you have a conversation with him about Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell? And then a lawyer steps in on behalf of Donald Trump, on behalf of the Republicans, and says, as we talk, on behalf of Lutnick, as we talked about before, we're not going to answer questions under executive privilege. We're here to answer your questions. We're not going to violate executive privilege. And then the questioner goes, and that was a clarification for me whether it was just not wanting to answer or whether it was an executive privilege assertion. Then another lawyer for Lutnick and Trump and the DOJ and the MAGAs go, there's a process for you to go through if you'd like to seek that information, and I'm happy to talk with you afterwards if that's something you want to pursue. Then the lawyer goes, yeah, just the question here is whether it's on an executive privilege, but I understand that the question is not being answered. I got that. But I'm just asking whether it's an executive privilege basis or just choosing not to answer the question. And then the lawyer for Lutnick says, I have not gone through the formal process to do that. Let me rephrase the objection. I think it's been asked and answered. In other words, on a very basic question, at any time when President Trump was president, did you have a conversation with him about Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell? Immediate objection right there. You see for yourself. That's a cover-up. I don't know how else to describe what's going on. Donald Trump in China selling out the United States. Xi Jinping is talking about Donald Trump, you better give me Taiwan, all of these things. And now we have the transcript knowing the cover-up is in full swing. Democratic Congressmember Walkinshaw posted the following. The transcript of Howard Lutnick's interview is out. Here he tries to explain that he found Epstein so gross that he wouldn't be in a room with him, but he was okay to take his wife and family to lunch on Epstein Island. Bottom line, Lutnick lied. And I want you to watch this also because Lutnick here also refuses to discuss his communications with Donald Trump. So Congressmember Walkinshaw says, okay, I'm struggling sitting here listening to you try to describe and define I. And I, as a man, I'm trying to figure out what exactly you're saying. I think if the American people saw it on video, they would be struggling as well. But you said on the podcast, my wife and I decided that I will never be in the room with that disgusting person ever again. You said married people will understand that. So your position, Howard, is you were so turned off by him. He was so gross, something weird sexually going on in his house, that you as a man, Howard Lutnick, did not want to be in a room with him alone, but you were okay with your wife and family being in a room with him? I'm struggling to understand that. I'm a man too, with a wife and a child. If I felt someone was so gross, more than me not wanting to be in a room with him, I would not want my wife and my children to be in a room with him. But you're very definitive that it's you, Howard Lutnick, that couldn't be in a room with him. Then Lutnick says, I had an informal conversation with my wife, and that's what we discussed. And I would think that most people who are married would understand. They have a conversation with their wife that someone says something inappropriate, gross, that when you leave with your wife, she says, you should avoid that guy. He's gross, right? And I did. So I don't think that's I think that's kind of inconsequential, which means just avoid him, which I did. So I don't understand, actually. I would think people who are married would understand that conversation with their wife when they met someone who was inappropriate to say you should avoid him, and I did. And then Congressmember Walkinshaw says, respectfully, Mr. Secretary, I think most people who are married would say we should never be in a room with him again. But have you had any conversation with anyone in the White House, setting aside the president, because you're refusing to discuss conversations with the president? Any conversation with anyone who works in the White House about today's interview? No. Okay, thank you. We can go off the record. In other words, he's not responding to any question about his conversations with Donald Trump. Then Secretary Lutnick says in another part of this deposition, I asked him, Epstein, why he had a massage table in the middle of his house. This is my best recollection. It's not like precisely what he said. This is a general recollection of something that's 21 years ago. So I said, how often do you have a massage? And he said, my best recollection, he said, every day, and the right kind of massage. And he said it to me, and my wife is standing next to me. And we looked at each other and we left. Question, for the record, what did you interpret Epstein to mean when he said the right kind of massage? Answer, that it would become in some form of sexual in nature. And that's what I assumed it meant. So as you go through this transcribed interview, it talks about how in 1997, I, Howard Lutnick, purchased an unfinished townhouse as my family home in New York City. Renovations took several years due to September 11th. Approximately 8 years after our purchase in 2005, we moved into the new home. That's when he talks about Epstein knocking on the door. He goes into Epstein's home, and then he says that there's this interaction where Epstein talks about the massages, and I never saw him again. Then Lutnick talks about that there was a 2011 incident where he talked over the phone with Epstein about scaffolding, he says. And then he says 18 months later, his staff, this is how Lutnick describes it. In 2012, his staff inexplicably contacted my office, unprompted, regarding my family's planned holiday travels to the Caribbean. Unbeknownst to me, his staff somehow had become aware that my family and I would be near his island over the holidays, although they were apparently unsure whether that meant during Thanksgiving or Christmas holidays. I still have no idea how his staff discovered my family's vacation plans or why they pursued arranging a visit with me. And then Lutnick describes it as it's inexplicable and it's disturbing. He goes, my family of 6 and another family, we had a brief, meaningless, and inconsequential lunch on the island, and then we left, he says. And then he goes on to talk about, this incident. Let me show you another point that just raises all sorts of red flags. Question. So on the podcast, you said, after seeing the massage table in Mr. Epstein's house and the 6-8 steps it took for you and your wife to get back to your house, you decided, and I'm quoting, I will never be in the room with that disgusting person ever again. Is that an accurate characterization of the statements you made on the podcast? Answer. This is an informal, incomplete discussion that my wife and I had as we walked back. The point of which was that when I discussed it with my wife, I, Howard Lutnick, would not have a personal, professional relationship with this person because he obviously doesn't have boundaries. So just avoid him. I should avoid him. And that's what we discussed. It's not verbatim what we said because this is 21 years ago and it is what I did. I avoided him. How did you avoid him? You went to the island. What are you talking about that you avoided him? And then he's asked the question over here. I want to briefly talk about statements that you made related to, and I'm going to your statement that Epstein had an MO to give massages to influential individuals, that he used it as blackmail. For the record, was that based on your firsthand knowledge or not based on your firsthand knowledge? And then Lutnick goes, I was just speculating for a podcast. I had no personal information. I was just speculating for a podcast. So for the record, did Jeffrey Epstein ever inform or represent to you that he was a part of any intelligence service, including for the United States? Answer, no. So how would you characterize your relationship with Epstein? I had no professional relationship with him. I had 2 interactions in person that were meaningless and inconsequential. I would say I had no relationship with him. And then what about your conversations with Ghislaine Maxwell? Page 20, meaningless and inconsequential. Then it goes on to talk about here. And you discuss the invite in your opening statement, but I'm going to ask you, how did your visit to Little St. James, Epstein Island come about? Who coordinated it? And this is the answer. What I still cannot understand is this November 20th, or how or why, without any communication for years, would inexplicably know where I'm going. How would he inexplicably know where I'm going? It's unsettling, actually. But this is how it happened. I don't know why it happened, but you're actually literally seeing how it happened. But it's inexplicable that he would, and his staff would know where I was going to be. I had no interaction with him. So to be clear, this is a question, you did not reach out yourself to tell Mr. Epstein that you were going to be in the U.S. Virgin Islands over Christmas. Is that right? Answer, yes. And answer, yes. I did not in any way contact him or have any connection with him. Question, and it would be safe to say that the invite surprised you? I find it unsettling and inexplicable. And that's the same line he uses when he's questioned about AdFin Solutions. Question, and what about AdFin Solutions? Answer, it was a company that attempted to create an exchange for online ads. They went out of business. Were you personally an investor in AdFins? No. Was Cantor Fitzgerald your company? Answer, yes. And then the question says, well, the signatory page from the investment to AdFin Solutions, you said you had not seen that? Is it common for another investor in a VC deal, a venture capital deal, to have the signatory page from another investor? How did Epstein, in other words, get your signature page? Lutnick's response, no. I found it inexplicable and unsettling that it was released, that my signature, my company's signature page would be in someone else's files. It's unsettling. I have no clue how it got there. I find it inexplicable and unsettling. And then there was a question about those masks that looked like Lutnick's face in Epstein's Island in that kind of dentist area. And then someone said, and then he was asked about, the face, and what you think about that. And, was that your face? And then Lutnick is like, No, the question. The reason we introduced that photo of that face is that many people speculate that that mask resembles you, specifically the one on the first page in the middle. What's your response to the claims that that's you? Answer. You've got to be kidding. This is the most ridiculous and absurd thing I've ever heard. What, a bald man? I have hair. Look, I mean, I don't have many, but at least I have some. This is not remotely me. That's nonsense. And that's where he was going. And then the questioning also pointed out that I want to note for the record, this is a transcribed interview. It's not being videotaped because the majority, the Republicans, decided that the American people don't deserve to watch this testimony when all the other interviews were depositions under oath. So there you have it, folks. I can keep going on, but I think you get the point. That gives you a summary. I'm quoting directly what Lutnick is saying while Donald Trump is out there and while Lutnick is covering up for Trump, refusing to talk about their communications, asserting executive privilege in the Epstein files. And I'll leave you with this thought. If they're asserting executive privilege in this informal interview, think about the millions of documents that may likely be withheld under executive privilege claims. We don't have a privilege log, so we don't even know what they are. Just think about that. Hit subscribe. Let's get to 7 million subscribers. And thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to add the MeidasTouch podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts for new updates every single day.